Alright, so after the storming of the Bastille, the National Assembly began transforming centuries of French tradition. So in August of 1789, they had eliminated all the taxes that were already owed by peasants, and they took away the First Estate's legal privileges. So the taxes that peasants had to owe but couldn't afford to pay, they just sort of wiped them off the books. Clean slate type of government right there. Um, they also, in 1789, adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. So this was basically their Declaration of Independence. And it laid out the basic principles of the Revolution. So liberty, equality, and fraternity or brotherhood. They were inspired by the English Bill of Rights and the American Declaration of Independence, but also inspired by the Enlightenment philosophers. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen states that all men are born equal and are equal before the law. And it guarantees freedoms like speech, the press, and religion. Alright, so Louis was alarmed by what was going on, and he made the mistake of calling troops to Versailles to protect him and his family. So what happened is that this pretty much angered the common people because they were afraid that the king would crush the revolution. So in October, a crowd of about 7,000 women marched to Versailles, and they broke into the palace and demanded bread for their children. And to make peace with the crowd, Louis agreed to return to Paris and live in the palace with his family, because at this point he was still in Versailles, which was outside of Paris. So this control of the royal family actually encouraged the revolution's leaders to take bolder steps, and they passed several reforms, including making the clergy public employees. They also seized church lands and sold them to pay off France's debt. So the actions by the revolutionary leaders angered a lot of people, especially clergy, because they felt like they were being personally victimized by the revolution. So in 1791, the Constitution was finally finished, and it created what was called the Legislative Assembly, and this was a new legislative body. So they gained voting rights as long as you were male, you owned land, and you were older than 25. And it kept the monarchy but severely restricted the king's power. So Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette knew they weren't safe, so they put on disguises and tried to sneak their family out of Paris. But they were recognized and brought back to the palace and sort of placed under house arrest. So if you remember, Marie Antoinette was from Austria. She was kind of the sweetheart of Austria, and so Austria and Prussia warned France against harming their monarchs, saying that it could provoke war. And to kind of show their power, Austria also sent 50,000 troops to the French border, which the French leaders saw as a threat, and the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria. Their army was quickly defeated, but this financial strain of war and the financial strain of war and food shortages and that inflation, like the rise of prices, led to a lot of unrest. So people blamed the army's defeats, they blamed the food shortages, they blamed pretty much anything they could on the king. And they feared that the achievements of the revolution would be overturned, so they ended up taking extreme action. And this was, they threw the whole royal family in prison and declared an end to the monarchy. So France was now a republic. Alright, so the French Republic. The new government was under the control of radicals, and this is when the revolution took an extreme turn. An extreme turn. So the new legislature, which was called the National Convention, it was established when they established the Republic. It split itself into three factions. So the Mountain was the most radical group, and their members were called Montagnards, and their support came from lower middle class and the poor people. The next group was the Girondins, who were more moderate, and they resented the mob mentality that the revolution had taken on. They partially supported a constitutional monarchy. The third group was the Plain, and this group was basically swing voters, so they could agree with either side depending on what the issue was. And so what the National Convention did was they placed the king on trial. And the Girondins had been hoping to be able to avoid this, but the Montagnards wanted to execute the king because they wanted to prevent the return of the monarchy. So Louis XVI was quickly condemned to die, and his execution date was set for the next day, January 21st, 1793. So what happened is that Louis tried to make a speech, and he was at the scaffold, began to deliver the speech proclaiming his innocence, but a drum roll kind of drowned out his voice, and he was pushed on to place on the guillotine, which, as you know, probably was a device that dropped a sharp, heavy blade through the victim's neck, and his head was cut off in the middle of his speech. So, France had executed their king. Alright, so in addition to executing their king, the radical government of the National Convention decided it was time to tighten control over France. So they set up a committee to manage defense spending. They also set up a military draft, and they established a court called the Revolutionary Tribunal, which rooted out and eliminated people who they deemed were a threat to the revolution. They also tried to cut all ties to the past. So one of the more interesting ways that they did that was they replaced Roman Catholicism with what they called the cult of the Supreme Being. And this was where people worshipped pretty much the revolution instead of, they worshipped the enthusiasm for the revolution instead of a god. So they replaced their old system of measurement with the metric system, and they also made a new calendar that had 3 weeks with 10 days in them. And this eventually fell out of fashion, but the metric unit is still in use. Another thing they did was they changed the way that playing cards looked. So our playing cards, they have a king, a queen, a jack, and then numbers. Well, theirs, instead of having king or queens, they would replace them with revolutionary ideas. So, like, in place of a queen might be the freedom of worship, or different professions of the revolution. Dress also changed, so women began to wear light and loose dresses instead of the thick with 10 petticoats underneath like they had been wearing. Okay, so this kind of brings in the Reign of Terror. And the resistance to the revolution was pretty much rooted in the countryside. So there were country peasants who just wanted their tax system reformed, and then when they got that, that's all. They returned to their conservative views, they remained Catholic, and they opposed the anti-religious move that revolutionary leaders were imposing. So the institution of the draft was the last straw for the peasants. So one of the village rebels declared, and here's a quote, it says, "They have killed our king, chased away our priest, sold the goods of our church, eaten everything we have, and now they want to take our bodies. No, they shall not have them." So the institution of the draft was the last straw for them, and this pretty much led to a civil war. It didn't last long because the peasants were defeated, but it was enough to kind of slow it down a little bit, but not much and not for long. So another part of the Reign of Terror is the Revolutionary Tribunal. And basically, anyone who had ever questioned the revolution or anything about the revolution was in danger of being hauled in and put on trial. It was very Inquisition-like. people who were hauled in and put on trial didn't have very many rights, and they weren't able to defend themselves. And the most common sentence in the revolutionary tribunals was death by guillotine. So it was very quick and very painless as having your head cut off could be. And it was very efficient. It was so efficient, in fact, that the executioner could do more than one execution per minute. And they actually needed this because executions became so common. And they became so common that people began to complain that blood was overflowing the city's drainage ditches. So they weren't able to irrigate their fields, and they weren't able to drain off like in storms because the drainage ditches were filled with blood. So the Reign of Terror lasted about 10 months, and its leaders eventually faced the guillotine as well. So first they kind of turned on each other and accused each other of not supporting the revolution. And then eventually the rest of them were faced with the guillotine as punishment for instituting the Reign of Terror. So about 17,000 people in all were executed. And even though that was a small percentage of France's whole population, the violence pretty much shocked the French as a whole, and it increased a lot of foreign opposition to the revolution. So after the Reign of Terror ended, France had to start over with a new government again. And they adopted a new constitution and a new governing body, which they called the Directory. And this board was made up of 5 directors who were supposed to make laws and pass reforms, but it wasn't effective at all. They argued among themselves, they were weak and corrupt, and again, it led to high prices, bankruptcy, and more unrest. So there's no happy ending for France just yet, and with no one in control, it was obvious that there was change around the corner. And we will talk about that change tomorrow.